Hello and thank you for watching the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. As we watch the aftermath of the brutal terror attack on Israel and currently what's happening in the attack on the Gaza Strip, concern is growing over the horrific human cost and the urgent worry over how the ramifications will unfold. Where does the world go from here? Joining me today is a public intellectual for whom this is personal. Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari, the best-selling author of crucial books, including Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. Mr. Harari, thank you for joining NDTV. As someone who is so personally connected to Israel, and also a public intellectual who has championed peace, how do you view the events you currently see unfolding? First, of course, the horrific attack in Israel, the brutalities we've seen, the fact that hostages are still being held, and the aftermath in Gaza.
Yeah, these are extremely difficult times, also for me personally. I have many friends and family in the communities that have been attacked and massacred, and we hear more and more stories of really terrible atrocities. Parents murdered in front of their children, civilians, people tortured in the most gruesome ways that terrorists could think about, hostages now being held, including babies and old people. And we also see the waves of violence spreading to more and more places, threatening the lives, the hopes of millions of people in the region. And maybe the most frightening thing is that this is all intentional. The aim of Hamas was not to try and conquer territory or to fight soldiers. The aim of Hamas was to destroy all chance for peace. Mm-hmm. Because, this happened exactly when Israel was on the verge of a historic peace treaty with Saudi Arabia, which was also supposed to alleviate the suffering of millions of Palestinians in the occupied territories and to restart the peace process, hopefully. Yes. And this was the aim of Hamas. I mean, Hamas did not try through this attack to restart the peace process. It tried to make sure that there will never, ever be peace by planting seeds of terrible, terrible hatred and pain in the minds of millions of people.
In fact, also, Mr. Harari, as we are seeing this unfold, we saw the condemnation which came from nations across the world, including India, very strongly backing Israel. But as we see what unfolds, is also two compelling beliefs emerging. A compelling belief that Israel has the right to self-defense, almost in a sense to avenge the brutalities you've just talked about. And the equally compelling belief, which is in a sense clashing with what perhaps Israel's current policy is, asking that why should every Palestinian pay the price for what Hamas has done? Because you've heard many Israeli ministers say that you cannot separate Hamas from the ordinary Palestinian, that they could not have survived in Gaza without the support of ordinary Palestinians.
We should not fall into these dark places. Israel should not fall into the same level as Hamas. It should be very clear that Hamas and the Palestinian people are not the same thing, that there are millions of innocent civilians, Palestinian civilians, that are caught in this war which Hamas started, but that Israel as a democratic country which abides by international law and norms should not target civilians for revenge. Yes, in a war, unfortunately, of course, civilians in a place like Gaza are harmed, but this should not be the aim of Israel. Israel has a duty to protect its citizens and its territory. I think it also has a duty to protect its humanity and the chance for future peace. And it's extremely difficult because, the mind of Israelis is now so filled with pain that they are almost incapable of acknowledging the pain of anyone else. But this, we must fight not just for our territory, but for the survival of our humanity, and should not commit unnecessary crimes against innocent people. We should be very clear that the war is against the Hamas terrorists.
So when you hear words like collective punishment being used, and of course the point being made by many nations that the response of Israel of collective punishment is against international law, the president of the Palestinian Authority saying that asking for release of hostages as well as saying that the Palestinian people are not represented by Hamas. Do you think words like this ring true when you're talking about what Israel is currently going through? How do you actually reconcile those arguments?
And it's difficult, but it's not impossible to wage war against a terrorist organization like Hamas while trying to protect as much as possible the basic rights of innocent civilians. And part of the problem is that Hamas is holding hostage not just Israeli civilians, but also millions of Palestinian civilians. Hamas is deliberately using Palestinian civilians as human shields. Hamas has placed many of its installations, of its weapon systems inside Palestinian population centers, and is, according to many reports, trying to prevent civilians from leaving these combat zones in order to make it more difficult for Israel to focus only on fighting the terrorists. So, and this is what terrorists have been doing in many places, but this is our duty as a democratic country to make the effort that Hamas is not making. And again, it's very important to remember that there is no real chance for peace as long as Hamas continues to hold this kind of power. And this is not new. From the moment it was established, Hamas never accepted the existence of the State of Israel and did everything in its power to prevent also previous peace processes like the Oslo peace process. So anyone who is in favor of peace should also be in favor of disarming Hamas. And maybe the most important immediate step is to demand the unconditional release of all the hostages that Hamas took. Because we are talking about 2-year-old babies, we are talking about our grandmothers, about peace activists. Like my uncle's community, Kibbutz Be'eri, I know it very well. I'll give you just one example. A peace activist there, Vivian Silver, she's a 74-year-old lady. She dedicated her life to peace for many years, despite having repeated rocket attacks from Gaza on her community. She drove sick people from Gaza to receive treatment in Israeli hospitals. Now she's held hostage by Hamas. I think anyone who is in favor of peace and humanity should demand the immediate release of all these hostages, not as on condition that Israel do this or Israel do that. When you hold a 2-year-old baby hostage, there is no condition. Just release it immediately.
Of course, and really, when you talk, Mr. Harari, the fact remains that voices like yours seem almost drowned out in the din, in the noise we're hearing. Of course, as I said, the condemnation about the brutalities that happened, the Hamas terror attack in Israel, but also the fact that we see the divides that are emerging about the whole debate about whether babies who are murdered in their cribs were beheaded or not, the debate about an Israeli baby versus a Palestinian baby. Does this discourse actually only add to the horror that we are seeing around us? Because you've talked, of course, of collective humanity, but Hamas seems to have struck where it wanted, not just in the physical murders and brutalities, but also in this discourse that we're currently seeing globally and amplified by online platforms.
Yeah, I mean, this competition of suffering is not doing anybody any good, except for Hamas. This is Hamas's aim. This is why it also spreads all these terrible images and stories online. And this is really, again, the struggle to preserve our humanity in the face of such atrocities, that we don't fall victim also to this trap laid by Hamas, that anyone who cares about human suffering should focus at the present moment on how do we get out of this seemingly endless cycle of violence. And I'll say another thing, that deep down, the problem is that Hamas just doesn't care about human suffering at all, whether Israeli or Palestinian, because we are talking about religious fanatics who believe that by what they are doing, by murdering people, when they die, they will get to heaven and there enjoy everlasting bliss for their souls. And because of that, they don't care about this world. They are willing to burn this world, to consign it to flames, and to inflict terrible suffering on millions of people, both Israelis and Palestinians, because they believe that by doing that, their souls will have everlasting bliss in another world. And it's impossible to have any chance for peace with people who hold such beliefs.
You made that point earlier as well, that the West doesn't understand this kind of religious fanaticism, which just happened as well with Hamas. India, of course, has had bitter experience of this as well. But we also see a larger clash, a larger divide emerge, because some would say it is politically naive to say Hamas has acted on its own, that of course there is funding from Iran, the view that Russia is backing Iran here, and also the Russia and China role as part of a larger alliance against the West and their stand in the Ukraine war. So it's part of a larger political game, which is not something which can be dealt with military force alone.
Again, if we broaden our perspective, we see this is just one conflict among many conflicts which are now getting worse and worse. And it's very simple. Over the last few years, there has been increasing attack on the world order. There was a global liberal order based not just on international laws and norms, based on really a philosophical or spiritual understanding that all human beings share the same basic experiences. We all suffer from pain. We all love our parents, our children, whether we are Palestinian or Israeli, Iranian or American. And because we all have these shared experiences, we have some common interests and values. And there was in recent years a concerted attack on this global liberal world by figures and politicians from throughout the world, saying, no, there are no universal values, there is no place for a global order, and they offered nothing to replace it. And when you destroy order, what you get is disorder. What you get is chaos. And this is now the price we are paying for the dismantling of the global order, not just by figures like Putin in Russia, also by politicians like Donald Trump in the United States, who attacked the global order. And if we don't make an effort to create a new order, then this chaos, which we are now seeing in my home country and in Palestine, we will see it in more and more places around the world.
India, of course, went through the horrific terror attacks in Mumbai, 26/11, 9/11 in the United States. But yet you feel that this is different, that this is not exactly the same playbook. But what seems almost common is the terrorist desire to almost, and again to use the words perhaps from the Iraq war, that of shock and awe, that the more horrific it is, their aim has been achieved. And also, in this era of disinformation, because we're really seeing war as a video game, so there's almost a sense of blood sport when you're seeing the missile strikes back and, who is the victor of this war. Yet, there is no victor here.
Yeah, there cannot be a victor in this competition of violence unless we stop it. But this is, at the present moment, this is almost impossible to do. And one thing you mentioned all the horrible images that are now circulating online. I would recommend to people not to watch such horrors too much. You're just doing violence to your own minds. You're just doing what the terrorists want, which is to sow seeds of hatred in your mind and lose all trust in humanity. Maybe you think that by watching all these horror videos, you're somehow showing empathy to people, but you're not. You're just sitting alone at home somewhere, feeding your mind with terrible, terrible hatred and fear, and actually isolating yourself from other people. If you really want to help, cut down on the consumption of these terrible materials, and instead do something practical to help people. Whether it's to help people, in the Middle East by donating or by joining some peace initiative, or even helping people immediately around you. But the reaction to this level of horror is not to kind of immerse ourselves in it. It's to try and see what is a practical step, tiny step that I can do to make the world a little bit more peaceful and more compassionate.
Mm-hmm. There was commentary which said the world changed after that attack, and we've of course seen that when there have been other horrific events like this happen as well. But what we are seeing play out, and it perhaps goes to that point you made on a change in an order, you're seeing on U.S. campuses. We've seen what happened with the Harvard signature campaign, and the immediate backlash you're seeing against students who signed. Yeah. You saw in London, where you are currently, of course, the huge marches, and many British commentators saying, is this what our country has become? Is it also about a larger clash? And I want to bring in the religious aspect, which you talked about, a larger clash we're seeing, especially in Europe, where we've seen that the population demographics have changed because of the large number of immigrants, and there will inevitably be a backlash to this given what's happened in Israel, and the fact that many, we've seen Muslim groups or maybe just Muslim people are identifying with linking what happened with Hamas to crimes perhaps against the Palestinian people.
Yes, again, I would say to people, if you're now in the conflict zone, or if you have immediate family in the conflict zone, then again, your mind is filled with pain right now. And it's almost impossible to expect psychologically that you'll be able to identify with the pain of others. But for people who are not now in the conflict zone and or don't have immediate family in the conflict zone, don't be lazy. Don't fall victim to intellectual laziness. Don't just take one side and see only part of reality. Try to make the effort to see the complexity of the situation. In almost every major conflict in history, the situation is complex. People, nations are usually at the same time both victims and perpetrators. Nations usually don't want to admit it. People like simple narratives. We are completely good, all evil is on the other side. And the other side says the same thing. We are pure, completely good, we never done anything wrong to anybody, 100% of evil is on the other side. Again, when you're immersed in a sea of pain, this is the psychological, but when you're outside of it, you don't have the luxury to have this kind of intellectual laziness. In almost no case is the world divided so clearly and simply into 100% purity and 100% evil. Mm-hmm. So make the effort in whatever side you choose, make the effort to understand the complexity. And as an Israeli, I would say to pro-Palestine protesters in places like London, in Europe, yes, you have a legitimate cause to support Palestinian civilians in the terrible time that they are now going through. But this should not spill over into racism, into anti-Semitism, into incitement for more violence.
And do you feel, because again, the Western value system, what you just referred to as was seen at one time as perhaps a universal order, but we've seen, and this happened for us in the Ukraine war, for India, that India made it very clear that their view of what should be done did not perhaps coincide with the Western view. India has also come out very strongly in support of Israel against terrorism, which has been a break from India's foreign policy in a sense in the past. So do you think the fact that the Western politics, the value system, now increasingly irrelevant in parts of the world, whether it's India, whether it's the global south, whether it's referring to Ukraine, and that now organizations like the United Nations are now increasingly irrelevant when we're looking at the current world order and situation?
We need to distinguish between two things regarding the world order.
Sure.
The current or the previous world order was established after the Second World War and was largely dominated by Western powers like the US, like Britain, like France. And the world has changed, and we now see the rise of non-Western powers like India, like Brazil, and they should play a much more central role in the global order. That's absolutely the case. But there must be some order, and this order must be based on some universal values. Now, we know what is the liberal suggestion for these values. As I said before, it's based on the idea that all humans are biologically the same. We all share the same experiences. So there should be universal values of compassion and universal interests, that all humans, despite our differences, there are some things that we should unite around. Now, if people say, we don't like these liberal values, okay, what is your counter-suggestion? When I listen to people like Putin, like Xi Jinping or whatever, they attack this kind of liberal view of the world and the idea of universal values. They don't offer anything in exchange. They don't offer any other universal values that could be a basis for an alternative order. And again, if you don't have order, you have disorder, you have chaos, you have violence. So either go back to the liberal order and its universal values, or let us hear not my country first. Okay, your country first, but how do different countries relate to each other? How do you provide peace? How do you even manage trade without some universal laws and norms and values? And if you don't have an alternative suggestion, so what is on the table is going back to the liberal global order based on liberal values with a much more important place around the table for non-Western countries like India or like Brazil.
Do you link this Hamas terror attack to the larger, say, umbrella of what many have called Islamic terrorism? Do you find that there is common cause, and you of course compared the attacks in a sense to this what the ISIS modus operandi is, but do you find that if you look at it through the prism of Islamic terrorism, and you've made that point about religious fanaticism, there is actually a larger clash which boils down to perhaps a civilizational aspect or a religious aspect which is being overlooked?
Yeah, I think, again, I wouldn't focus all the attention necessarily on one religion, on Islam. Mm-hmm. I think the major issue is dealing with religious fanaticism. That during different periods in history, you saw it in a lot of different religions. Once you're dealing with people who, because of religious fanaticism, their focus is not on this world. Their focus is not on human suffering in this world. Their focus is on another world. Then we have a big problem, because these types of people, they are willing to destroy this world completely and inflict, again, terrible suffering on millions, on billions of people, because they just don't care about it. You know, you listen to the Hamas speaking, and they basically say that even Palestinian suffering doesn't interest them, because in their view, if a Palestinian dies because of an Israeli attack, a Palestinian civilian, doesn't matter dies because of an Israeli attack, that person immediately goes to heaven as a martyr to enjoy everlasting bliss. Now, if this is your worldview, you don't care even about people dying from your side, not to mention people dying from the other side. This type of religious fanaticism that we saw with ISIS, we now see with Hamas, but we have in history saw from different religions. This is a terrible danger to the whole of humanity. And, as the sophistication of technology increases with nuclear weapons, now with artificial intelligence, the danger increases. Because these are the types of people that if weapons of mass destruction fall into their hands, they have the type of worldview which will enable them to use these weapons and annihilate this world.
So where does the world go from here? Really, as a historian, where does the world go from here? Because the worry, of course, that you have the Russia-Ukraine war. Again, it seems a war which the world has lost interest in, but it is still causing a great deal of human suffering. We see this current conflict. There may be more conflicts coming in the Armenia region. Where does the world go from here? Do you see this as the most dangerous time, as some observers have put it, since World War II? Could we be looking at another World War III if we see conflicts erupting like this and the sense of the world moving from one to the other and losing interest in the last one?
Absolutely. Again, it's what I said before. Order is collapsing and is replaced by chaos. This has been happening for the last 5 to 10 years. We see it in more and more places. The pandemic was part of it. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is part of it. What's happening now in Israel and Palestine is part of it. If we don't rebuild order, it will only become worse. It will spread all over the world. It could lead to the Third World War. And with the type of weapons and technology now available, it could lead to the annihilation of humankind itself. We shouldn't lose hope. This is a time for responsibility, not a time for despair. Again, anybody who has any ability, this is the time to rebuild order, to try and rebuild hope. And the very first step that I would focus now, again, going from the kind of very broad perspective of the global order to the immediate crisis in my home country, the first step is to immediately release without condition all the hostages. This is important not only in itself as liberating these people from terrible suffering, but because this will give hope, this will give breathing space, and will be a first step perhaps to de-escalating the conflict and going back to the path of peace.
Do you see, Mr. Harari, finally the US, of course, playing a crucial role here, countries like Saudi Arabia and India? What do you think India, how do you think we just had a G20 in India where we looked at us establishing our place diplomatically? Do you think you now need different alliances and equations, not the traditional ones, but what would you ask of countries like the US, Saudi Arabia and India to do at this point?
Well, with regard to India, which is now one of the most important world powers, India is in a unique position. It is a democracy. It is committed, unlike, Russia or China, it is committed to democratic ideals, but it has good relations with many of these countries and also with Iran. So hopefully India will use whatever leverage it has on countries like Iran to de-escalate, first of all, to prevent further escalation of the conflict. Secondly, to try and de-escalate the conflict. And again, first step that should be clear and obvious to everybody, release immediately all the hostages.
Right. Yuval Noah Harari, thank you so much for joining me. As I said, I know how personal this must be for you as well, but thank you for being the voice of reason and, of course, reminding us of the lessons history has taught us and sadly is teaching us again. Thank you very much for being on the NDTV Dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you.